Greetings, friends of liberty. When we gaze across the channel now, from Dover, Deal, or Dymchurch, men see in revolutionary France the infectiousness of the ideas of that most troubled of French philosophers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. 'Tis no wonder our neighbors have descended to their present state of terror. In that rogue Rousseau, we see a mind filled with false ideas, one after another, as that of the noble savage, as if the Aztecs and Mayans in their bloodthirsty human sacrifice were noble, or by his idea that only direct democracy could work, as if the members of the House of Commons or Lords serve no useful function, or finally, his idea that children, those little rapscallions, are somehow purer and more noble than the rest of humanity. But speaking now of the infectious ideas in your own 21st century, in his recent book, The Parasitic Mind, How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense, evolutionary biologist, marketing expert, and Concordia University professor Gad Saad endeavors to explain and describe the nature and origin of the rise of political correctness in the West. Are PC ideas infectious? Are the SJW minds colonized by these ideas parasitic? And if he hadn't suffered a severe soccer injury, would God have become the Lebanese equivalent of the great Argentinian star, Lionel Messi? These are the questions we will answer today. God begins by describing the elements of numerous contemporary ideologies, idea pathogens, afflicting the West. He destroying many of them with his concentrated intellectual firepower at point-blank range. Let's examine a part of the vast field of intellectual debris left behind, starting with the idea that biological sex is simply a social construct. Here God, the evolutionary biologist, has partly done his own research on, for example, how with males, the ring finger is usually longer than the index, and that this digit ratio captures the extent of androgen exposure of an infant in the uterus, with marked correlation with other male traits such as risk-taking and courtship. That is astonishing. God has also studied how boys and girls from different ethnic groups and cultures generally enjoy playing with similar sex-specific toys the world over. Boys with guns or toys with wheels, and girls with dolls. And incidentally, he's found that the greater the digit ratio, the greater the preference for male toys. Furthermore, why do women statistically like men who are higher in social status, who are ambitious and hardworking, whereas men tend to like younger, poorer mates, preferring an hourglass figure? Is this mere social convention? And additionally, how very puzzling that men universally are more inclined towards the visual consumption of Playboy or even more explicit men's magazines, whereas women would rather relax with Danielle Steele's 5 Days in Paris or Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Excuse me. Having finished debunking the shimmer of the social construction of sex, God trains his fire on Islam, describing at length how the reality is far different than liberals imagine. How, for example, the alleged peace between Christians and Muslims in medieval Andalusia was, to a significant degree, a myth. How there are more words of anti-Semitic hate in the Quran than in Hitler's Mein Kampf. How Christians, in contrast, rarely react with violence, as the Jerry Seinfeld episode with the tears of the Virgin Mary illustrated. Number 4, how at least one Islamic astronomer believes the world is flat. Number 5, how incompatible Sharia law is with Western standards of justice. And finally, number 6, how ethnic and racial profiling of people like himself, who are olive-skinned and come from the Middle East, is entirely justified. God is a virtual tornado of points arguments, jokes, and observations, a few of which shall complete our description. He remarks on how he introduced his own term, which he calls collective Munchausen syndrome, which is allegedly when people pretend to have some affliction or trauma getting them social attention, such as being a victim of MAGA hat-wearing Republicans putting a noose around your poor neck in the dead of a cold Chicago winter night. He talks of how people in warmer climes eat more spicy foods, very likely because of their antibacterial properties, how beta males sometimes are so compassionate to women because of ulterior motives, and finally how, quite tongue-in-cheek, God beats almost everyone else in victimology poker, being a BIPOC Lebanese Jew. So how should we evaluate this tidal wave of information, this unique combination of satire and argument, which constitute God's approach to combating wokeness? It must be admittedly, firstly, that God reveals in numerous instances an understanding that the origin of wokeness is in higher education. In chapter 4, he mentions how, while propaganda in authoritarian countries comes directly from the state, in America it comes indirectly from higher education. In chapter 8, when he says that higher education shouldn't lower its academic standards. And in chapter 1, where he calls universities patient zero for a broad range of dreadfully bad ideas and movements. The problem, however, is that God doesn't ever realize that our colleges and universities are as intellectually pathetic in the humanities as they are because of their extensive funding and control by our government, both of which has increased enormously since World War II in the 60s. And it's surprising that God wouldn't understand how the governmental funding of thousands of woke departments in white, black, fat, disability, indigenous, queer, and other studies has created wokeness, since God explicitly self-identifies as a libertarian, as I do, and even mentions the great 20th century free market economist and champion of economic freedom, Ludwig von Mises. Libertarians understand that public education is not a public good, but instead a public bad. In order to illustrate God's failure here, let's use the analogy that God himself uses of idea pathogens. Let me adopt a similar analogy. Imagine an alcoholic who's gone on an extended bender for 6 months, getting 3 hours of sleep a night, drinking 12 beers a day, and consuming little else in calories. If that person then, after a half year of this, because his immune system has been so drastically compromised, comes down with pneumonia, the dreaded Streptococcus pneumoniae, we would understand that it was his lifestyle which likely caused his illness, not the bacteria. In the same way, God completely fails to mention that our universities and colleges have lost their intellectual and academic immunity to various mind viruses, idea pathogens, precisely because they are no longer directly funded and controlled by us, the people, but instead by our government and its civil rights mandates and legislation. God nowhere criticizes Title 7 and 9 of our Civil Rights Acts. In its totality, this extensive governmental funding and control has led to our humanities departments being radically weakened, just like the immune system of our alcoholic, allowing these idea pathogens, which in themselves are nonsensical and not especially virulent, to so easily enter into and colonize higher education. God's fundamental analogy, thus, is false. Now, this is not to say that showing how false these postmodernist ideas of gender and racism and Islamophilia are is a bad thing, since debunking these ideas does have some value in treating our society once the ideas have been let loose in it. In other words, God in this book can be analogized to a physician who makes enormous efforts to treat our alcoholic well and to save his life, while at the same time never informing him that it was his 6 months bender which likely caused the pneumonia. In other words, all our physician does is to point his finger at the bacteria instead of the behavior, with its resulting reduced immune response. And there is yet another criticism, unfortunately, to be made of God. In this book, he talks about himself constantly. I count over 600 uses of the word I, over 140 of the word me, and over 350 of the word my. A virtual tsunami of self-references. Is this normal? Well, let's control for Jewishness and see how often Ben Shapiro, in his book, The Authoritarian Moment, whose text is 25 pages shorter, uses these words. Ben uses the word I about 180 times, so less than 1/3 as much. He uses the word me about 40 times, so again less than 1/3 as much. And he uses the word my about 70 times, so less than 1/5 as much, or about 1/5. Now, why would God use these words so much more than Ben? I can think of two possible reasons, and there may be others. First, God is of Lebanese origin and thus belongs to a Mediterranean culture, and these, such as Italian, Greek, and Spanish, are known for being very sociable and gregarious. So in talking about wokeness, God may be recounting so often his own personal experiences, using these references because of his essentially very sociable nature, through which he has had many encounters and engagements with the woke, either in person or online. On the other hand, God is a professor of marketing, and it's not out of the realm of possibility that God here is, whether unintentionally or not, marketing or signaling himself. But God is happily married, so it couldn't be sexual signaling. In the end, it could be either of these two factors, sociability or marketing, or both to some degree, or some third unknown reason. But it does become tiresome in the end to my ears, and a stricter focus on his subject matter might at least have given God a greater likelihood of discovering the actual cause of the rise of political correctness and wokeness, since we don't just want to treat the symptoms, as God is doing, but to identify and eliminate the cause. Now, as to our final question, whether God would have been the next Lionel Messi without his injury. Well, given his videos of himself doing tricks with a soccer ball on the beach, I would not discount this possibility in the slightest. However, given God's stouter physiognomy, I would rather compare him to Maradona instead of Messi. On that note of Soccer Insight, I bid you all well and remain as ever, Scarlet Pimpernel.